They abandoned an alien slave outside my cabin. She was shivering in the snow. The wind howled through the pine trees surrounding the mountain cabin as Kyle Manning checked the time on his old watch. It was nearly midnight, and the temperature had dropped to 15 below zero. He lived alone in these mountains by choice after spending 20 years in the Colonial Defense Force fighting wars on distant planets. He wanted nothing more than silence and solitude. Kyle had built this cabin with his own hands 5 years ago after retiring from military service. The nearest town was 40 miles away, down a winding mountain road that became impassable during winter storms. He liked it that way. Fewer people meant fewer questions about his past and the things he had seen during the war. He was pouring himself a glass of whiskey when he heard the sound. It was faint at first, almost lost in the wind, but his trained ears picked it up immediately. Something metallic hitting the frozen ground, followed by what sounded like a vehicle speeding away. Kyle grabbed his rifle from above the fireplace and moved to the window. His cabin sat in a small clearing surrounded by dense forest. The motion sensor lights he had installed around the perimeter suddenly flicked on, illuminating the snow-covered yard. That was when he saw a figure lay crumpled in the snow about 30 feet from his front door. The body was motionless and partially covered by the falling snow. Kyle watched for several minutes, looking for any sign of movement or threat. His military training made him cautious of traps and ambushes. When nothing moved except the falling snow, he finally opened the door and stepped outside. The cold hit him like a physical blow. Despite his heavy jacket, he kept his rifle ready as he approached the figure. As he got closer, Kyle realized this was no human being. The creature was humanoid in shape with 2 arms and 2 legs, but that was where the similarities ended. Her skin was a pale blue color that seemed to shimmer even in the harsh LED lights. She wore nothing but torn rags that provided no protection from the brutal cold. Long silver hair was matted with ice and snow. Heavy metal shackles bound her wrists and ankles, connected by short chains that severely limited her movement. The metal looked strange, not like any alloy Kyle recognized from Earth or the colonies. Strange symbols were etched into the surface. Kyle knelt beside her and checked for vital signs. Her skin was ice cold to the touch, but he felt a faint pulse at her neck. She was alive but barely freezing to death. He made a quick decision, slinging his rifle over his shoulder. Kyle scooped the alien woman into his arms. She weighed almost nothing. Despite being nearly 6 feet tall, he carried her quickly back to the cabin, kicking the door shut behind him to keep out the cold inside. He laid her on the thick rug in front of the fireplace. The fire was burning hot, and he added more logs to increase the heat. He grabbed every blanket he owned and piled them on top of her. Then he filled his largest pot with water and set it on the stove to heat. Kyle knew the basics of treating hypothermia from his military training. Warm the victim slowly and steadily. Sudden heat could cause shock and kill them just as surely as the cold. While the water heated, he examined the shackles more closely. The metal was definitely not from Earth. It had a strange weight to it, and the symbols glowed faintly with a purple light. He tried to find a lock or release mechanism, but there was nothing he could see. The woman began to shiver violently under the blankets, which Kyle took as a good sign. It meant her body was trying to warm itself. He soaked several towels in the warm water and carefully placed them on her exposed skin, avoiding any sudden temperature changes. For the next 2 hours, Kyle worked to warm her. Gradually, he changed the towels frequently as they cooled and slowly increased their temperature. He melted snow to give her small sips of water when she seemed semi-conscious enough to swallow. Around 3 in the morning, her eyes finally opened. They were unlike any eyes Kyle had ever seen. The irises were a deep violet color with flecks of silver that seemed to move and shift in the firelight instead of round pupils. Hers were vertical slits like a cat, but the intelligence behind them was unmistakably sentient. She stared at Kyle for a long moment. Her expression unreadable. Then she tried to speak, but only a weak, rasping sound came out. "Easy," Kyle said quietly, holding up his hands to show he meant no harm. "Don't try to talk, yet you nearly froze to death out there." The alien woman looked around the cabin, taking in her surroundings. Her gaze lingered on the rifle leaning against the wall, then moved to the windows as if calculating escape routes. Even in her weakened state, she was assessing threats. Kyle recognized the behavior. He had done the same thing countless times. He stood slowly and moved to the kitchen, returning with a cup of warm broth he had heated from a can. He knelt beside her again and held out the cup. "You need to drink this. It will help warm you from the inside." She eyed the cup suspiciously, but after a moment she reached for it with shaking hands. The chains on her wrists clinked as she moved, reminding Kyle of their presence. He watched as she took a small sip, then another. Soon, she was drinking the broth in larger gulps, her body desperate for warmth and nourishment. While she drank, Kyle examined her more closely. Now that she was conscious, the torn rags she wore had once been some kind of uniform. He could see faded markings that might have been rank insignias or identification numbers. There were scars on her arms and legs, both old and new. Some looked like they came from weapons, others from shackles like the ones she wore. Whoever she was, this woman had suffered. When she finished the broth, she handed the cup back to Kyle and spoke. Her voice was rough and weak, but understandable. "Why did you help me?" Her English was perfect, though. Her accent was strange, unlike anything Kyle had heard before. "You were dying," Kyle said simply. "What else would I do?" She studied him for a long moment, as if trying to determine whether he was lying. "Most humans would have left me to die or killed me themselves." Kyle felt a cold anger settle in his gut at those words. Not most humans. The woman almost smiled at that, but the expression was bitter. "No. I suppose you are not. Most humans would not live alone in such a remote place. Most humans fear solitude." Kyle didn't respond to that. Instead, he asked the obvious question. "Who are you, and how did you end up outside my cabin in the middle of a blizzard?" Woman was quiet for so long that Kyle thought she might not answer. Finally she spoke. "My name is Kira. I am Zinthari. My people come from a world in the Outer Rim territories." Kyle nodded. He had heard of the Zinthari during his time in the Colonial Defense Force. They were one of the many alien species humanity had encountered. After developing faster-than-light travel, the Zinthari were known to be excellent navigators and pilots. Their natural ability to perceive multiple dimensions made them invaluable on long space voyages. "But I am no longer free," Kira continued, her voice dropping to barely above a whisper. "I am property, a slave." She held up her shackled wrists as evidence. Kyle felt his anger grow. These were slave shackles. He had seen similar restraints during the war used by pirates and criminal syndicates to control captured prisoners. The practice was illegal throughout human-controlled space, but that didn't stop it from happening. "Who owns these shackles?" Kyle asked, though he suspected he already knew the answer. "A human named Vincent Crane," Kira said, her violet eyes hardening with hatred. "He leads a trafficking ring that operates in the frontier territories. They capture non-human species and sell them as slaves to the highest bidder." Kyle knew the name Vincent Crane was wanted by every law enforcement agency in human space. His organization had been trafficking aliens for nearly a decade, moving constantly to stay ahead of the authorities. He was ruthless and violent. Anyone who interfered with his operation ended up dead. "How did you escape?" "I didn't escape," Kira said, her voice filled with bitterness. "They dumped me. They decided I was no longer profitable." Kyle frowned. "What do you mean?" Kira looked away from him, staring into the fire. "I was a navigator for Crane's organization. He forced me to plot jumps through dangerous space regions that no sane pilot would attempt. Many of those jumps damaged my neural pathways." She tapped her temple. "My ability to navigate is failing. I am becoming useless to him. So he just abandoned you," Kyle said, the anger in his voice clear. Kira nodded. "Crane knew we were passing near this region. He had his men shackle me and throw me out in the middle of your winter storm. He probably thought it would be entertaining to let me freeze to death rather than simply shooting." Kyle stood and paced across the cabin, his mind racing. Vincent Crane had dumped a living sentient being in the snow to die for entertainment. The thought made him sick. "We need to get those shackles off you," Kyle said. Finally, "Do they have a key?" Kira shook her head. "The shackles are locked with a biometric code. Only Crane or his top lieutenants can remove them. If anyone else tries to force them open, they will inject poison into my bloodstream. I will die in seconds." Kyle cursed under his breath. "That complicated things. Then we need to find another way. There has to be someone who can Trade the lock." Kira looked at him with something like hope in her strange eyes. "There is a man in the city of Redstone, about 200 miles from here. He is a tech specialist who works outside the law. He might be able to hack the shackles if we can reach him." Kyle knew Redstone. It was a frontier city that served as a hub for miners and traders who worked in the asteroid belt beyond. It was also known as a haven for criminals and smugglers. The kind of place where you could buy or sell almost anything if you knew who to ask. 200 miles in this weather, Kyle said, looking out the window at the blowing snow. We won't be able to use the roads, they are completely snowed. And Kira struggled to sit up, the blankets falling away from her shoulders. Then I am trapped here until spring by then. Crane will have moved on and I will never be free. Kyle shook his head. There might be another way. I have a skimmer in the garage. It's an old military model built for rough terrain it can handle. The Snow Kira looked at him in surprise. You would take me to Redstone. Why would you help me? You don't know me. Kyle met her gaze steadily because leaving you in chains is not an option, and because Vincent Crane needs to answer for what he has done for. The first time Kira smiled a real smile and Kyle saw hope light up her unusual eyes. We should rest first, Kyle continued. You are still weak and the journey will be dangerous. We will leave at first light. Kira nodded and settled back down under the blankets. Her eyes were already closing, exhaustion pulling her toward sleep. Kyle added more wood to the fire and sat in his chair watching over her. He didn't sleep much anymore. Not since the war tonight. He would keep watch. The next morning dawned. Clear and cold, the blizzard had passed, leaving behind 3 feet of fresh snow. Kyle was already up making breakfast when Kira woke. She moved slowly, still stiff from her ordeal. But she seemed stronger. Kyle handed her a plate of eggs and toast. Eat, you will need your strength. Kira ate quickly, using her shackled hands awkwardly when she finished. Kyle brought her some of his old clothes. They were too large for her, but they were warm and far better than the rags she had been wearing. The skimmer sat in the garage covered by a tarp. Kyle pulled it off, revealing a battered but sturdy vehicle. It was built low to the ground with wide treads that could handle any terrain. The military gray paint was chipped and faded, but Kyle had kept the engine in perfect condition. He loaded supplies into the back: water, food, medical supplies, and weapons. He strapped his rifle into the rack behind the driver's seat and added a pistol to his belt. Kira watched him work. When you said you were in the Colonial Defense Force, what did you do? Kyle paused in his packing. I was a combat engineer. We went into hostile zones to build forward operating bases and secure territory. That explains the weapons, Kira said, and the way you move. You are always watching, always ready for a threat. Kyle shrugged. Old habits. They climbed into the skimmer and Kyle started the engine. It roared to life, the sound echoing in the small garage. He opened the garage door and guided the vehicle out into the deep snow. The skimmer handled the terrain easily, its wide treads churning through the powder. Kyle followed an old logging road that wound down the mountain toward the valley below. The going was slow but steady. Kira sat in the passenger seat watching the forest pass by. She seemed fascinated by the snow-covered landscape. We don't have winter like this on my world, she said softly. Our seasons are much milder. What is your world like? Kyle asked. Kira smiled. It is beautiful. We have vast oceans that shimmer with bioluminescent life. Our cities float on the water powered by tidal generators. My people love the sea. We are most at peace when we can see the horizon. Kyle heard the longing in her voice. When was the last time you were home? 5 years, Kira said. Quietly, Crane captured my ship when we were on a trading mission to the frontier colonies. He killed most of my crew, but kept me alive because of my navigation abilities. I have been his slave ever since. Kyle gripped the steering wheel tighter. 5 years in chains, forced to work for the man who murdered her friends. He couldn't imagine that kind of suffering. We will get you free, Kyle said. It wasn't a promise. It was a statement of fact. Kira looked at him. Why do you care so much? You don't know me. You have no obligation to help me. Kyle was quiet for a moment, considering his answer. Because I have seen what happens when good people do nothing during the war. I watched entire colonies fall to raiders and slavers because nobody was willing to stand up and fight back. I swore that if I ever had the chance to make a difference, I would take it. Kira reached over and placed her shackled hand on his arm. Thank you, Kyle Manning. They drove in comfortable silence for several hours. The skimmer made good time on the old logging roads by midday. They had descended from the mountains into the valley below as they approached the main highway. Kyle spotted something that made him slow down. There was a checkpoint ahead. 2 vehicles blocked the road and 4 armed men stood guard. They wore mismatched armor and carried military-grade weapons. Kyle recognized the setup immediately. This was not an official checkpoint. Slavers, Kyle said quietly. Get down and stay out of sight. Kira immediately slid down in her seat, pulling a blanket over herself. Kyle continued toward the checkpoint at a casual speed, trying to appear unconcerned. One of the guards held up his hand, signaling Kyle to stop. He did so, keeping his hands visible on the steering wheel. The guard approached the driver's side window. He was a large man with a scarred face and cruel eyes. Where you headed? The guard demanded, just passing through on my way to Redstone. Kyle said calmly. The guard looked over the skimmer, his eyes lingering. On the supplies in the back, you living up in the mountains, that's right. I have a cabin about 50 miles north, the guard grunted. You see anything unusual last night? We are looking for some lost property. Kyle kept his expression neutral. What kind of property? The guard leaned closer, an alien female, about 6 feet tall, blue skin. She escaped from her owners. We are offering a reward for information. Kyle shook his head. Haven't seen anyone. I was snowed in at my cabin all night. The guard studied him for a long moment, then stepped back. All right, move along. But if you see anything, you contact us immediately, understood? Kyle nodded and put the skimmer in gear. He drove past the checkpoint at a steady pace, not too fast to seem suspicious. Once they were out of sight, he accelerated. Kira sat up slowly, her face pale. Those were Crane's men they are searching for. Kyle nodded. We need to get off the main roads. They will have checkpoints at every major intersection. He turned onto a smaller side road that led east toward the Badlands. It would add time to their journey, but it was safer than staying on the highway. For the next 3 hours, they drove through increasingly rough terrain. The skimmer handled it well, but Kyle had to slow down to navigate around boulders and steep ravines. Late afternoon, they reached an abandoned mining settlement. The old buildings were falling apart. Their roofs collapsed under the weight of years of snow. Kyle parked the skimmer behind one of the larger structures out of sight from the road. We will rest here for a few hours, Kyle said, and wait until dark to continue. Kira nodded. She looked exhausted. The stress of the day had taken its toll. Kyle helped her out of the skimmer, and they moved into one of the more intact buildings. The interior was cold and dusty, but it provided shelter from the wind. Kyle cleared a space on the floor and laid out blankets. He shared his food with Kira, and they ate in silence as night fell. Kyle kept watch. From a broken window, he could see for miles across the empty Badlands. No lights, no movement, just endless snow and rock. Kira came to stand beside him. You are different from other humans I have met, she said. Most of your kind only help when there is something to gain. You have nothing to gain from helping me, yet you risk your life. Kyle didn't look at her. I told you before, I can stand by and do nothing. But there must be more to it. Kira pressed. You could have called the authorities. Let them handle Crane instead. You are personally taking me to Redstone. Wakil was quiet for a long time when he finally spoke. His voice was low. During the war, I was part of a unit that liberated a slave camp on a frontier world. The things we found there, the condition of the prisoners. It still haunts me. We were too late for most of them. He turned to look at Kira, his eyes hard. I swore I would never be too late again if I can help someone who is suffering. I will, no matter the cost. Kira reached up and touched his face gently. You carry a heavy burden. Kyle pulled away, uncomfortable with the intimacy. We should rest. We have a long drive ahead of us. They slept in shifts. Kyle taking the first watch, he sat by the window, his rifle across his lap, and watched the stars come out. The night was clear and bitterly cold, around midnight. Kyle woke Kira for her turn to watch. He lay down and closed his eyes, trusting her to alert him. If there was any danger, sleep came slowly, haunted by memories of the war. Kyle woke to the sound of engines. He was on his feet instantly, rifle in hand. Kira was already at the window, her face tense. Vehicles approaching from the south. She said 3 of them. Kyle moved to her side and looked out. Sure enough, 3 sets of headlights were cutting through the darkness, heading straight for the abandoned settlement. We need to move now, Kyle said. They grabbed their gear and ran for the skimmer. Kyle started the engine and pulled out from behind the building, heading north away from the approaching vehicles. But it was too late. They had been spotted. The 3 vehicles changed course, pursuing the skimmer, their engines roaring as they accelerated. Kyle pushed the skimmer to its limits, but the pursuing vehicles were faster. They began to close the distance. Kyle swerved between boulders and around rock formations, trying to lose them in the rough terrain. The skimmer bounced and shook, but held together. Gunfire erupted behind them, bullets ricocheting off rocks. Kyle cursed and pushed the skimmer even harder. Kira braced herself against the dashboard, her eyes wide. Can we outrun them? Not in this terrain, Kyle said. We need to find cover somewhere we can defend. Ahead. He spotted a narrow canyon cutting through the Badlands. He aimed for it and plunged into the darkness. The canyon walls rose on either side, creating a natural tunnel. The pursuing vehicles followed, but the narrow space forced them into single file. Kyle took advantage of this. He slammed on the brakes and spun the skimmer sideways, blocking the canyon grab. The rifle, Kyle shouted to Kira. They jumped out and took cover behind the skimmer. The first pursuing vehicle screeched to a halt 20 yards away. Armed men poured out, taking positions behind rocks. Kyle fired first, dropping one of the men with a precise shot. The others returned fire, forcing Kyle and Kira to duck behind the skimmer. We are pinned down, Kira said. Kyle checked his ammunition. Not good, we can't hold this position for long. Then we need to break out, Kira said. Give me a weapon. Kyle handed her his pistol. Have you fired a gun before? Kira nodded once when I tried to escape Crane. I didn't succeed, but I learned. Kyle smiled grimly. Good, then cover me. He rose and fired a burst at the enemy position, then ran to a boulder. On the right side of the canyon, Kira opened fire, keeping the slavers pinned down from his new position. Kyle had a better angle. He fired carefully, taking down 2 more men. The remaining slavers tried to fall back, but Kyle kept up the pressure. Of the men made a break for his vehicle. Kyle tracked him and fired. The man went down suddenly. The canyon was quiet. Kyle waited, watching for any movement. When none came, he signaled to Kira. They advanced carefully, checking each fallen enemy. All dead, Kira said, checking the last one. Kyle nodded. We need to keep moving, more will be coming. They returned to the skimmer and continued through the canyon. It opened onto a wide plateau, and Kyle turned east again toward Redstone. The rest of the night passed without incident. By dawn, they were within 50 miles of the city. Redstone rose from the barren landscape like a fortress. Walls of metal and concrete surrounded the city proper, and guard towers marked the entrances. Kyle knew the city had been built during the mining boom 20 years ago. It had grown quickly, becoming a center for trade and commerce in the frontier. It had also become a haven for criminals. Kyle drove to the eastern gate and joined the line of vehicles waiting to enter. Guards checked each vehicle before allowing it through. Kyle had prepared a cover story, but he hoped they wouldn't need it. When their turn came, a guard approached the skimmer state. Your business in Redstone. Resupply, Kyle said. We are heading back out to the mining territories next week. The guard looked past Kyle at Kira, who kept her head down and her shackled hands hidden under the blankets. He your partner? That's right, Kyle said. The guard seemed satisfied. He waved them through. Kyle drove into the city, relieved they were in. Now they just needed to find the tech specialist Kira had mentioned. Kira directed Kyle through the crowded streets. Redstone was a chaotic place with people from dozens of different species crowding the sidewalks. The buildings were a mix of old mining structures and newer construction, creating a patchwork cityscape. They parked in a public garage and walked the rest of the way. Kira kept her shackles hidden under long sleeves and gloves. Kyle stayed close, watching for any sign of Cranesmen. The tech specialist's shop was in the lower city, a maze of narrow alleys and underground passages. The shop itself was unmarked, just a reinforced door with a security camera. Kyle knocked. The door opened a crack, and a thin man with cybernetic eyes peered out. What do you want? Kira stepped forward, removing her glove to show the shackle. I need these removed. The man studied the shackle, then looked at Kira. Recognition flashed in his cybernetic eyes. You are property of Vincent Crane. He will kill anyone who helps you. Kira met his gaze steadily. I can pay. The man hesitated, then opened the door wider. Come inside quickly. The shop was cramped and filled with electronic equipment. The tech specialist, whose name was Danny, examined the shackles closely, using various tools to scan them. These are military-grade restraints, Danny said, with a biometric lock and poison delivery system. Very sophisticated, can you remove them? Kyle asked. Danny nodded slowly. Yes, but it will take time and it won't be cheap. The system has multiple fail-safes. I will need to bypass each one carefully. How long? 4 hours, maybe 5. Kyle looked at Kira. She nodded. Do it, Kyle said. Danny got to work connecting various cables and devices to the shackles while he worked. Kyle and Kira waited tensely. Kyle kept watch at the door, his hand never far from his weapon. The hours crawled by. Finally, Danny sat back and wiped his forehead. Done. The locks will release in 10 seconds. Kira held her breath, counting down when the shackles clicked open and fell to the floor. She actually gasped in relief. She rubbed her wrists where the metal had chafed her skin for 5 years. Thank you, she said to Danny, her voice thick with emotion. Danny, nodded Kyle, paid him with the last of his credits, and they left the shop quickly. Once they were back on the street, Kira stopped and looked at her bare wrists, tears streaming down her face. I am free, she whispered. I am finally free. Kyle gave her a moment, then gently touched her shoulder. We need to keep moving, Crane. Probably has people watching the city if they spot you. Kira nodded, wiping her eyes. You are right. Where should we go? Kyle had been thinking about that. We need to get you off-world, somewhere Crane can't reach you. Do you have any contacts anyway to get home? Kira shook her head. My people think I am dead. It has been 5 years. They will have held mourning ceremonies. I have no way to contact them from here. Then we need to find a ship. Kyle said there is a spaceport on the north side of the city. We can try to book passage. They made their way through the crowded streets toward the spaceport as they walked. Kira suddenly grabbed Kyle's arm. There, Kira said, pointing across the street. One of Crane's lieutenants. I recognize him. Kyle followed her gaze and saw a tall man with a scarred face talking to 2 armed guards. The man was showing them something on a datapad, probably a picture of Kirawi. Need to go? Kyle said, pulling Kira into a side alley. They moved quickly through the back streets, trying to put distance between themselves and Crane's men. But as they rounded a corner, they found their path blocked. 6 armed men stood waiting for them, weapons drawn. Vincent Crane himself stepped forward from behind his men. He was a large man in his 50s with cold gray eyes and an arrogant smile. Well. He said, you have caused me a great deal of trouble, Kira. I am impressed you made it this far. Kira stood tall despite her fear. I will never go back to being your slave. Crane laughed. You don't have a choice, my dear. You are my property, and I always collect what belongs to me. Kyle stepped between them. Kira is not property. She is a free person, and she is under my protection. Crane looked at Kyle with amusement. And who are you? Kyle Manning, formerly of the Colonial Defense Force. Crane's smile faded. Ah, yes, I have heard of you. The hero who liberates slaves. How noble, but you are outnumbered and outgunned. Surrender. The Zinthari and I might let you live. Kyle didn't move. I don't think so. Crane sighed. Then you will both die. His men raised their weapons. What happened next occurred in seconds. Kyle drew his pistol and fired in one smooth motion, dropping 2 of Crane's men before they could react. Kira rolled to the side, grabbing a fallen weapon. Gunfire erupted in the alley. Kyle dove behind a metal container, returning fire with deadly accuracy. Years of combat training took over his movements, became automatic. Seek cover. Acquire target fire move. Kira fought beside him, her movement surprisingly skilled for someone who claimed limited weapon experience. Together they held off Crane's men, but more guards were arriving, drawn by the sound of gunfire. We are surrounded, Kyle shouted to Kira. Then we fight our way out. She shouted back. Kyle admired her spirit, even facing impossible odds. She refused to give up. They began moving down the alley, fighting as they went. Kyle fired in controlled bursts, making every shot count. Kira covered their retreat. They burst out onto a main street, civilians screaming and scattering at the sight of armed combat. Kyle spotted a transport truck idling near the curb. That truck, Kyle said. Get in. They ran for it. Kyle jumped into the driver's seat and started the vehicle moving. Kira fired out the window, keeping Crane's men at bay. Kyle drove recklessly through the crowded streets, crashing through barriers and sideswiping parked vehicles behind them. Crane's men pursued in multiple vehicles. The chase careened through Redstone for 20 minutes. Kyle used every trick he knew, cutting through alleys and taking sharp turns, but Crane's men stayed with them. Finally, Kyle made a desperate decision. He aimed the transport at the spaceport gate and accelerated. "Hold on," Kyle shouted. The transport smashed through the barrier. Alarms blaring, Kyle drove onto the landing field, heading for the nearest ship that looked ready to launch. They abandoned the transport and ran for the ship. Kyle fired at the pursuing vehicles, forcing them to take cover at the ship. Kyle pounded on the hull. "We need emergency transport," he shouted. A port opened and a crew member looked out. "Are you crazy?" "We are about to launch." Kyle held up a fistful. "Of credit chips, please." The crew member grabbed the chips and pulled them inside. The port sealed shut. 30 seconds later, the ship lifted off Kyle, and Kira looked out a porthole and saw Crane's men firing uselessly at the ascending vessel. "We made it," Kira said, her voice filled with disbelief. "We actually made it." Kyle allowed himself a small smile. "Yes, we did. The ship's captain." A grizzled woman named Lisa came to find them. "You two have caused quite a stir down there," she said. "Who are you running from?" Kyle explained briefly about Crane and Kira. The captain listened, then nodded. "Vincent Crane is bad news. She said the frontier will be better off without him. As it happens, I am heading to the Zinthari home system. I can drop you there." Kira gasped. "You can take me home." The captain smiled. "Of course that will cost extra," though Kyle paid what little credits he had left. It was worth it. The journey to the Zinthari system took 3 weeks. During that time, Kyle and Kira talked for hours, sharing stories about their lives and experiences. Kira told Kyle about her people and their beautiful ocean world. She described the floating cities and the great tidal festivals her people celebrated. She spoke of her family, whom she hadn't seen in 5 years. Kyle told Kira about Earth and his life before and during the war. He spoke about the things he had seen, both beautiful and terrible. He explained why he had retreated to his mountain cabin, seeking peace. They grew close during those 3 weeks. A bond formed between them, forged by shared danger and mutual respect. When they finally arrived at the Zinthari homeworld, Kira stood at the viewing port, staring at the blue-green planet with tears in her eyes. "Home," she whispered. Kyle stood beside her. "You will be safe here. Crane can't reach you." Kira turned to him. "What will you do now?" Kyle shrugged. "I will head back to Earth, back to my cabin." Kira took his hand. "You could stay here. My people would welcome you. You saved one of their own." Kyle considered it. The offer was tempting, but he knew he didn't belong here. "I appreciate that, but I need to go home." Kira nodded sadly. "Then at least let me give you something to remember me by." She leaned forward and kissed him gently when she pulled back. Her violet eyes were bright with emotion. "Thank you, Kyle Manning. You gave me back my freedom and my life. I will never forget you." Kyle smiled. "You are a remarkable person, Kira. I have no doubt you will do great things." They said their goodbyes at the spaceport. Kira was met by officials from her government who were shocked and overjoyed to see her alive. Kyle watched from a distance as she reunited with her family, then he quietly slipped away. The journey back to Earth took another 3 weeks. Kyle spent the time thinking about everything that had happened. He had left his cabin seeking solitude and somehow ended up on an adventure across the frontier. When he finally returned to his mountain cabin, the snow had begun to melt. Spring was coming. Kyle settled back into his routine, chopping wood, maintaining his property, and enjoying the silence. But something had changed. He no longer felt the same need to hide from the world. 6 months later, Kyle received a message on his secure terminal. It was from Kira. She had been restored to her former rank in the Zinthari Navigation Corps, and was working to expose and shut down trafficking operations throughout the frontier. She thanked Kyle again for his help, and invited him to visit any time. Kyle smiled as he read the message. He sent back a brief reply wishing her well. Then he stepped outside into the warm summer evening. The mountains were beautiful this time of year. Green and alive, Kyle Manning had found his peace. But he had also learned that sometimes peace meant taking action when someone needed help. That was a lesson he would carry with him for the rest of his life. And if another person ever needed his help, he would be ready. The end.